She had been abandoned at the altar by the man she loved, betrayed by the sister she trusted, and left to carry the wreckage of a life that had never been truly hers to begin with. Most women, after all of that, would have stopped believing in signs. They would have closed the curtains, turned away from the night, and let the dreams dissolve into the ordinary darkness behind closed eyes. Alicia Gatherstorm was not most women, though she did not know it yet. The forest outside her cabin breathed the way forests always do in the hours before dawn, slowly, deeply, with the kind of patience that belongs only to ancient things. The pines exhaled cold mist. The stream that ran through the roots of the old oak murmured its endless, indifferent song. And the waterfall, not so far away, crashed and tumbled over stone with a sound like the world refusing to be quiet, refusing to let the night be completely still. Inside the cabin, Alicia slept, or tried to. She was 26 years old, and her hair was the color of winter light, white as frost, soft as the first snow that falls before the world remembers to be cold. Her skin was pale, the kind of pale that made people think of moonflowers and early mornings, and her face, even in sleep, held the particular sadness of someone who has learned to carry grief so long it has begun to feel like a natural weight, like something she was simply born to hold. She had moved to the cabin 4 months ago. After everything. After Carcius had taken her hand in the evening light and told her he loved her with his eyes pointed somewhere over her shoulder. After the wedding preparations had been made, the flowers ordered, the gown altered twice. After she had allowed herself, for the first and perhaps the only time in her careful, cautious life, to believe that she deserved something good. And then the night before the ceremony, she had found the note on the kitchen table. Short, almost casual in its cruelty. Carcius and Remilia had left together. Her mate, her sister, gone, as if Alicia had been nothing more than a door they both needed to pass through to reach each other. She had stood in the kitchen for a very long time, holding the note. She remembered the candle burning down to nothing on the windowsill. She remembered the way the wax had pooled on the wood and hardened before she thought to wipe it away. She did not cry that night. She was not sure she had cried since. Grief, when it goes deep enough, stops being something that comes out of you. It becomes something that lives inside you, quiet and permanent, like a stone at the bottom of a well. She had found the cabin through a woman in the village who felt sorry for her, and she had taken it without asking too many questions. It was small. 1 room, a hearth, a window that faced east so the morning light came in early and golden, a door that stuck in the rain. She had a garden that she tended more out of obligation than pleasure. She had herbs drying from the rafters, and a pot that was usually half full of something warm. She had silence. She had learned to be grateful for silence. But on this particular night, the silence was not quite right. There was something in it that felt alive, expectant, like the moment before a door opens without anyone having knocked. Alicia turned in her narrow bed, pulled the blanket higher, and tried to settle into sleep the way she always did, methodically, without hope, trusting that exhaustion would eventually do what willpower could not. And then the dream came. It came the way the most important things always come, without announcement, without ceremony, without the gentleness one might hope for. One moment she was drifting in that colorless space between thought and unconsciousness, and the next she was standing at the waterfall. The waterfall was real in the dream, the way it was real in waking life, insistently, physically real, filling the air with cold spray and the roar of water against stone. The moonlight struck the falling water and broke it into 1,000 small lights, and the rocks below were dark and wet and sharp. And there was a man. He was lying near the base of the falls, half in the water and half on the stone, and the way he lay told her immediately that he had not chosen to be there. His body had the particular stillness of someone who has gone beyond pain and arrived at something more frightening. One arm was extended toward the water, as if he had reached for it, and then forgotten why. Even in the dream, she could see how large he was. Broad through the shoulders, long in the limb, with the kind of body that suggested he had spent years asking it to do difficult things, and it had always obeyed. His hair was gold, the warm dark gold of late afternoon, and it fanned across the wet stone in loose waves. His face was half hidden by the shadow of the falls, but she could see the short beard, the strong line of the jaw, the way his mouth was slightly open as he struggled, even in unconsciousness, for breath. The blood was everywhere, dark against the stone. It moved with the current at the edges, unfurling like smoke in water. Alicia stood in the dream and felt the cold spray on her face and the sound of the falls in her chest, and she understood, with the absolute clarity that only dreams can offer, that the man was dying. Then the voice came. It was not a voice she recognized. It was not any voice she could place in the waking world. It was soft, and it was certain, and it arrived not in her ears, but somewhere deeper, in the place where instinct lives before thought can reach it. Save him. Just that. 2 words, and the dream dissolved. Alicia opened her eyes. Before we continue with the story, I want to thank everyone who supports the channel and loves our Alpha King romances. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, please consider clicking the link in the pinned comment to check out our Patreon and become a member. As a member, you'll get access to exclusive content you won't find here on YouTube, extended stories, special scenes, early access to new episodes, and complete romance arcs created just for our supporters. As a bonus, you'll also unlock exclusive vampire romance stories, diving into darker, more intense love stories filled with desire, danger, and passion. By joining, you're directly supporting the channel and helping us bring even more immersive stories to life. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and how old you are. I hope you enjoy the story. The cabin was dark. The fire had burned down to coals that glowed dimly behind the grate. Outside, the forest made its breathing sounds. The waterfall, as always, could be heard faintly through the eastern window, a low roar that usually helped her sleep. She lay completely still for a moment, staring at the ceiling, and tried to be reasonable. It was a dream. She was a woman who lived alone in a forest after having her life dismantled by the 2 people she had trusted most. She was prone, perhaps, to vivid imaginings. The mind, when it was lonely enough, sometimes manufactured urgency as a substitute for meaning. She knew this. She had thought about it on many of the long evenings she had spent alone. She lay still for another moment. Then she got up, put on her boots, pulled her cloak around her shoulders, and walked out into the dark. The forest at night was a different country than the forest in daylight. The familiar paths became suggestions rather than certainties. The light came only from the moon, filtering through branches that had just begun to show the first shy growth of spring, and the shadows were deep and shapeless. An owl called once from somewhere to her left, and then went silent. The stream glittered where the moonlight found it. Alicia walked to the waterfall. She walked because the dream had felt true. She walked because the voice had felt true. She walked because she had learned. In the 4 months since her life had ended, and something quieter had begun, that the things she felt most deeply were usually the things she least understood, and that did not make them less real. She heard the waterfall before she saw it, the sound rising as she came through the last stand of trees, and stepped onto the wide, flat shelf of rock that bordered the pool. The water fell white and loud and cold. The spray touched her face immediately, and she pulled her cloak tighter. She looked down. He was there, exactly as in the dream. The same man, the same position, the same terrible stillness, the same blood moving at the edges of the current. For one suspended moment, Alicia simply stared at him. The fact of his presence, the staggering, impossible fact of it, moved through her like a wave that starts slowly and then becomes, without warning, everything. Her rational mind offered a series of explanations, and she discarded all of them, because explanations were not what was needed right now. What was needed was speed. She moved. She crossed the rocks carefully, because the last thing either of them needed was for her to fall, and she knelt beside him in the shallow water at the base of the falls without flinching from the cold. Up close, she could see the wounds, 2 of them, deep and deliberate, one across his left shoulder and one lower, near his ribs, and both still bleeding in the slow, persistent way that meant they had not been stanched. There were older bruises, too, the yellowing kind that spoke of violence that had come before tonight's. "Hey," she said, and her voice came out surprisingly steady. "Can you hear me?" Nothing. His chest moved, but barely. She put her hands on the side of his face and tilted it toward her, and even like this, pale beneath the tan, lips pressed together against pain, eyes closed, she registered, in some distant part of herself, that he was extraordinarily handsome. Golden hair dark with water, jaw like something carved from stone, and even unconscious, even nearly broken. He looked like a man who was accustomed to being the most powerful thing in any given room. None of that mattered right now. "I'm going to move you," she told him. "I'm sorry if it hurts." She was not a large woman, and he was very much a large man, and what followed was the longest, most difficult quarter of an hour of her life. She got him to his knees first, then to his feet, with his weight crushing against her shoulder. And then she walked him, dragged him really, in the unlovely and unglamorous way that actual emergencies require, through the forest and back to the cabin. He was not entirely unconscious the whole time. There were moments when he seemed to surface, to become dimly aware of her effort, to try to shift some of his weight onto his own legs. Once, when she stumbled on a root and they both nearly went down, she felt his arm tighten around her shoulder in what could only have been a deliberate attempt to keep her from falling. She filed that away somewhere. Later, she got him through the door and onto the bed. Her bed, the only bed. And she stood over him for a moment, breathing hard, her white hair fallen loose from its braid, her cloak soaking wet from the waterfall's spray, her hands already moving to his coat to begin assessing the damage. He opened his eyes. They were the color of a winter sky just before a storm, a gray so deep it was almost blue, full of clouds and distance, and something that might have been, in another context, command. They found her face and stayed there, and for a moment, though he was gravely injured and barely conscious and lying in a stranger's cabin in the middle of the night, those eyes were entirely present. "Thank you," he said. His voice was low and rough with pain and exhaustion, and yet underneath that, unmistakably, there was a quality to it that she could not quite name. Authority, perhaps. The sound of a man who was used to having his words matter. Then his eyes closed again, and he was gone. Alicia worked through what remained of the night. She had learned herbcraft from her mother, in the years before her mother had decided that Ramilia was the daughter worth teaching, and Alicia was the one worth ignoring. She had continued on her own, out of stubbornness mostly, reading what she could find and experimenting in her small garden, until she knew, if not everything, then enough. The herbs she had drying from the rafters, yarrow and shepherd's purse for bleeding, calendula for healing, valerian to help the body rest, feverfew because she had been afraid of her own fevers since childhood and always kept it on hand, now became the materials of something that felt, in her hands, like purpose. She cleaned the wounds. She packed them with a yarrow paste and bound them with clean linen. She made a tea from the valerian, and managed, in one of his brief returns to partial consciousness, to get most of it down him. She built the fire up until the cabin was warm enough that the shivering in his large frame gradually quieted. She sat in the chair beside the bed and watched him breathe. And when his breathing became too shallow or too fast, she spoke to him, not because she thought he could hear her, but because silence felt, in that moment, like abandonment. She told him about the garden, about the herb that had refused to grow where she put it, and thrive the moment she moved it 3 inches to the left. About the robin that had built a nest in the split of the old birch near the eastern window, and was currently very busy and very loud about it. About the way the light came in the morning and how she had learned to calibrate her mood by how the light looked. Because the light was honest in a way that people rarely were. She did not tell him about Carcius. Not yet. She did not tell him much about herself at all, because the night was for him, and because she was not sure she had anything to say about herself that was not also about everything she had lost. By the time the first gray light appeared at the eastern window, his fever had broken, and his breathing had steadied, and the bleeding had stopped. Alicia put her head on her arms on the edge of the bed and slept for 3 hours. When she woke, he was still sleeping. She made porridge, ate standing by the window, and watched the robin, who was very cross about something and expressing it with great energy. This was how the first day began. The days that followed had a shape that Alicia had not expected. Not the sharp, tense shape of emergency, but something slower and more layered, with a rhythm that surprised her by how natural it felt. She cared for him through the fever that returned on the second day, and lasted through the third. She changed the dressings on his wounds, and noted, with quiet satisfaction, that they were healing cleanly. She cooked broth, and then soft foods, and then, by the 5th day, a proper meal, because his appetite had returned with a forcefulness that she recognized as health. He slept a great deal. When he was awake, he was largely silent, watching her with those storm-colored eyes in a way that was not uncomfortable, though she could not have explained why. There was nothing predatory in it. It was more like the careful attention of someone who was used to assessing situations and people, and was doing so now, methodically, with patience. On the 4th day, he told her his name. Odin, he said, when she came to check the binding on his shoulder. Just that. No surname, no title, no context. He offered it the way a man offers something he is accustomed to guarding. Alicia, she replied, and kept her eyes on the knot she was tying. I know, he said. You told me. When I was feverish. You told me your name, and then you told me about a robin. She looked up, startled. There was, at the corner of his mouth, the faintest suggestion of something that was not quite a smile, but was clearly its close relative. The robin is still very upset about something, she said, recovering. I think it may be a territorial dispute. Serious business, he agreed, and this time the almost smile became an actual one, brief and slightly crooked, and so unexpectedly warm that Alicia found herself turning back to the knot with unnecessary concentration. By the 6th day, he was able to sit up without her assistance, and on the 7th, he moved himself to the chair by the fire, slowly and carefully, but under his own power. And when he arrived there, he looked at her with an expression she recognized, the particular look of a person who is reassessing what they thought they understood. She had made tea. She brought him a cup and sat in the other chair, the smaller one she had dragged in from the corner, and they sat together in the warmth of the fire while the forest outside made its various sounds, and for a while neither of them spoke, because it turned out that some silences do not need to be filled. Tell me about yourself, he said eventually. He said it simply, directly, without the cushioning that most people apply to personal questions. It was a request, not a demand, but it came from someone who was used to being answered. Alicia considered the question. She was not accustomed to being asked. Not genuinely the way he was asking, with his full attention pointed at her, those gray eyes steady and present, as if her answer was actually going to matter to him. There is not a great deal to tell, she said. I came here 4 months ago. Before that, I lived in the eastern village. Before that... She paused, and was surprised to find that the words came relatively easily, the way things come out when you are tired of carrying them alone. Before that, I was going to be married. Odin was very still. Not the stillness of discomfort, but the stillness of someone paying close attention. She told him then. Not all of it at once. It came out in pieces over the days that followed, a detail here and a detail there, assembled gradually the way a mosaic is assembled, each piece separate, until suddenly you can see the whole image. She told him about Carcius, and about how she had believed, despite everything in her past that suggested she should not believe in things, that he was genuine. She told him about Remilia, her sister, 2 years younger, and always somehow both more beloved and more careless with what she was given. She told him about the note on the kitchen table, and the candle burning down, and the cold morning that followed. She told him about the days after, which she had spent mostly in bed, not because she was physically ill, but because getting up had seemed to require a reason that she could not locate. About the woman in the village who had offered her the cabin, and how she had recognized, even then, that she was not so much accepting a refuge as retreating from the world entirely. "And then I had a dream," she said, on the 7th evening, with the fire low and the night deep outside. "I dreamed of the waterfall. I dreamed of a man lying near the base of it, bleeding, and a voice told me to save him." She paused. "And I went. And you were there." Odin had been listening the entire time with that quality of attention that she was beginning to understand was simply how he was, completely, uncomplicatedly present when someone was speaking to him, as if each word was something worth receiving. "Why did you go?" he asked. "You could have told yourself it was only a dream." "I could have," she agreed. "But it did not feel like a dream. It felt like information." Something shifted in his expression. It was subtle. He was not a man who showed things easily, she was learning. But it was there. A flicker of something that might have been recognition. Might have been, she thought, something far more complicated. "You were very close to death," she added. "A few hours more, and I think the cold would have finished what the wounds began." "I know." He said it quietly, without drama. "I was aware of that, even in the dark. There is a moment when you know whether you are going toward the light or away from it." He paused. "I was going away from it. And then I heard your voice." Alicia looked at him. "I was talking to you all night," she said. "I was not sure you could hear me." "I heard you." He held her gaze with complete steadiness. "You told me about a garden, about an herb that refused to grow in the wrong place." Another pause. "You told me that the light in the morning was honest, that you had learned to calibrate your mood by how it looked." Alicia did not say anything for a long moment. "You seemed like someone who had survived something difficult," he said. "And yet you were there, caring for a stranger in the middle of the night. I thought—" He stopped, considered, and the slight hesitation was somehow the most human thing she had seen from him. "I thought that it takes a particular kind of person to do that. Someone who has not let the difficult things make them small." The fire crackled. Outside, an owl called, farther away than the one she had heard the night she went to the waterfall. "Or someone who has nothing left to lose," she said honestly. "No," he said. And his voice had that quality again, the quality she could not quite name. Someone who still has everything to give. Those are not the same thing. Most people confuse them. She looked at the fire. She did not have an answer for that, and so she did not manufacture one. But something in her chest, in the place where grief had lived for 4 months, like a stone at the bottom of a well, shifted very slightly. Like the stone was still there, but the water had moved, and for just a moment she could see through to something below. In the days that followed, as he grew stronger, and the wounds healed, and the sessions in the chair by the fire became longer, they talked. They talked the way people talk when they are in an enclosed space together and have moved past the performative stages of acquaintance. Honestly, specifically, without the usual editing that social situations demand. She talked, and was surprised by how much she had accumulated to say. 4 months of silence is a long time, and the things she had been thinking in that silence, about grief and its particular geography, about the difference between loneliness and solitude, about what it meant to rebuild a self from the materials that remained after something had been dismantled, poured out of her with a fluency she had not expected. She had not known, until he listened, how much she had needed to be listened to, and he talked, carefully and selectively, telling her things that were true but not yet all of the truth, because he was a man who understood the weight of revelation and was not ready to place that weight on something new. He told her about the years when the realm had been in conflict and what it cost to end a conflict, not in the abstract, political sense, but in the personal, specific sense of what it does to the man who has to be the one to end it. He told her about loyalty, how rare it actually was beneath all the professions of it. He told her about the particular loneliness of power, which was unlike other loneliness because it could not be admitted. He did not tell her who he was. He told himself this was prudence. He told himself he needed to know more, needed to understand the situation better, before he revealed anything that could endanger her. He told himself these things with reasonable conviction, right up until the moment he recognized that they were not the full truth. The full truth was simpler and more frightening. He did not tell her because he was afraid that once she knew, she would stop being the one person who had spoken to him, in recent memory, without any awareness of what he was, without the careful deference or the concealed calculation, or the exhausting theater of people who are always performing for an audience they believe holds their fate. She spoke to him as if he were simply a man, as if she were simply a woman, as if the two of them were simply two people in a warm cabin in a spring forest, finding, in the particular proximity of recovery and care, something worth finding. And it had been so long since anyone had done that, so long that he had nearly forgotten what it felt like. She brought him tea in the mornings without asking. She read by the fire in the evenings with her white hair braided over one shoulder and her feet tucked up under her, and a slight frown of concentration between her brows. She moved through the small space of the cabin with a quiet efficiency that had nothing performative in it. She was not tidy for an audience, was not graceful for effect, was simply herself in the way that a person is when they believe they are alone. On the 8th day, he stood at the eastern window and watched her tend the garden, and understood something with the certainty that the things you do not choose always carry. He was in serious trouble. For his part, he could not have said when it changed. There was no single moment he could point to and say, "There, that was when she stopped being the woman who had saved his life and became something else entirely." It was a slow process, made of small things. The way she laughed, when she laughed, which was not often but completely, as if laughter for her was not a social act, but a genuine surprise. The way she argued, direct and specific, never raising her voice, presenting her evidence like someone who has learned to trust only what can be demonstrated. The way she had, without any discussion, simply integrated him into the daily rhythms of the cabin as if he had always been there, and the question of his presence required no special consideration. She did not pity him. She treated his wounds with competence and care. But she did not look at him the way people look at the vulnerable, with that complicated mixture of compassion and superiority that makes the recipient feel simultaneously grateful and diminished. She looked at him the way she looked at everything, directly and without sentimentality, as if what she was seeing was simply what was there. On the 9th day, he helped her carry water from the stream, because he was well enough to be useful, and he could not sit in the chair any longer without contributing something. She directed him without embarrassment, and accepted his help without excessive gratitude. And when he miscalculated the weight of the bucket and sloshed water down his boot, she looked at him with such an expression of genuine amusement that he laughed, unexpectedly, from somewhere genuine, and the sound surprised both of them. "You laugh like someone who has forgotten how to," she observed. "I have," he said. "Somewhat." She considered this, then returned to the business of filling the second bucket. What took it away? He was quiet for a moment. Years of being responsible for things that go wrong when no one is laughing. She nodded slowly. That makes sense. She handed him the second bucket. Though I think you may have confused laughter with carelessness. They are not the same thing either. He looked at her. You keep telling me what I have confused, he said. You keep being confused about similar things, she replied. And there was a lightness to it, a gentle teasing that he had not heard from anyone in longer than he could easily remember, and he felt it land in him somewhere that had been expecting impact and received warmth instead. On the 10th day, she told him about the dream again, not because she had not already told him, but because she was thinking about it differently now, and she was used to thinking out loud with him in a way she was not quite used to thinking out loud with anyone. I have been trying to understand it, she said. They were at the table after the evening meal, and the remains of the food were between them, and the candle was burning low. Not the fact of it. I have accepted the fact of it, because the evidence is rather conclusive. She nodded at him, at the fact of his continued existence in her cabin, which was the most conclusive evidence available. But the nature of it, how it works, what it means, and I think it is connected to something. She turned her cup between her hands. In the old stories, the ones my mother told, before she stopped telling me things, there are accounts of Omega women who could sense when their fated mate was in mortal danger, who could be called to them through dreams. It was described as a spiritual tether, something that exists before either person is aware of it. She paused. I had always assumed they were stories, the kind of stories that give people hope without necessarily being true. The candle threw warm light across the table and across his face, and she watched him absorb what she had said with that characteristic stillness, that quality of a man sitting with something important and giving it the time it deserves. And now, he asked. Now I am revising my opinion of stories, she said. He was quiet for a long moment. The candle guttered slightly in a draft from somewhere. Outside, the spring night was warm enough that she had left the window cracked, and the sound of the forest came in with the cool air. The creek, the wind, somewhere far away the waterfall, always the waterfall. There are things I need to tell you, he said at last. She looked at him across the table and waited. He told her everything. He told her who he was. He watched her face carefully as he said it. Odin Prinstern, Alpha King of the realm, the one to whom the names of places and people and laws ultimately belonged. And he saw the sequence of responses move through her with the cleanness of truth being absorbed rather than performed. Shock first, visible in the slight parting of her lips and the widening of her eyes. Then a rapid reassessment of the things she knew. Then, and this was the thing he had feared and the thing that did not happen, she did not retreat. Did not become suddenly formal or careful or self-consciously aware. She absorbed it and remained herself, sitting across from him with her hands around her cup, looking at him with an expression that said she was deciding what to do with this information. All right, she said eventually. Just that. All right. You are not, he began. What? Overwhelmed. I am, a little. I need a moment. She looked at the table, then at him. But I had already noticed that you are not a common man. I had decided it was not my business, since you had not chosen to tell me. A slight pause. I understand now why you did not. He had not told her as a test. He wanted to be clear about that, to himself, if to no one else. He had simply arrived, finally, at a point past which he could not continue without the truth between them. But the fact that she passed through what might have been a test was not lost on him. He told her about the patrols, the secret routes he took alone, both to think and to keep his hand on the actual pulse of the realm, rather than only the reported pulse. He told her about the men who had followed him, men he had trusted, men whose loyalty he had believed in. Men who had apparently concluded that a dead king was more useful to their ambitions than a living one. He told her about the ambush, the blades in the dark, the fall, the cold water of the stream at the base of the waterfall, and the cold night air, and the slow, certain process of dying, and then her voice. As he spoke, something happened to her face, not softness exactly. She was not a soft woman, he had understood that clearly, but a kind of opening, as if the story explained something she had been carrying without knowing she was carrying it, and the explanation, even though it was heavy, was lighter than the unknown weight. "The tether is real then," she said quietly, when he finished. "According to the old lore, it only activates in true extremity. If you had not been close to death, you would never have dreamed of me," he finished. "We would never have met." She looked at the candle. "Carseus and Remilia did me a great cruelty," she said slowly. "And I have spent 4 months believing that cruelty was the end of the story." She looked up at him. It was not the end. It was a beginning. A terrible beginning, but a beginning. He held her gaze. "Some beginnings require a great deal of clearing first." "Yes," she agreed. "Yes, they do." The candle burned between them, and outside the spring night made its soft sounds, and neither of them said anything else for a while, because some things, once said, need to be allowed to settle like sediment in still water before you can see clearly through to the bottom. That night, Alicia lay in the cot she had been using since giving him her bed, and she thought about what it meant to be the kind of person who is led by a dream through a dark forest to save a dying king. She thought about the fact that she was, apparently, that kind of person. She had not known this about herself. She had been told at various points in her life that she was unremarkable, that she was too quiet, that she was the kind of woman who had the misfortune of being overlooked. She had believed this more than she should have. The tether suggested otherwise. The tether suggested that something in her, something in whatever she was at the deepest level, beneath the grief and the caution and the careful smallness she had learned to maintain, had recognized him before she ever laid eyes on him, had known that he mattered, had sent her into the dark to find him. She was not sure what to do with that. She was not sure she needed to do anything with it right now. But she held it, in the dark of the cabin, and found that it was not as frightening as she might have expected. Odin, in her bed, was not sleeping either. He was thinking about what came next. What came next was necessary and inevitable and potentially dangerous. And he had always been good at necessary and inevitable and potentially dangerous. The traitors needed to be confronted. His throne needed to be reclaimed. Not because he was certain he wanted it back in the way he had held it before, but because the alternative was to let dangerous men have it. And that was not something he could allow. There were people in the realm who needed a king who was not corrupt. He had always understood this. He understood it still. But he was also aware, with a clarity that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with the woman sleeping in the cot 10 feet away, that he was not the same man who had been ambushed in the dark 3 weeks ago. Something had changed in him. Some particular hardness, not the useful hardness, the hardness of spine and conviction, and the willingness to do difficult things, but a different kind, the kind that forms around old wounds and eventually begins to restrict rather than protect, had softened slightly, and he did not want to lose that. He did not want to lose her. The thought arrived with the inevitability of a stone dropped in water, and he did not argue with it. In the morning, he told her his plan. She listened to all of it. She sat at the table with her hands around her cup. She was almost always doing something with her hands, he had noticed, not from nerves, but from a kind of practical engagement with the physical world. And she listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she asked 3 questions. 2 about logistics, which were practical and pointed, and 1, the one that told him most clearly what kind of person she was, about the people who would be affected by the conflict that came before the resolution. He had thought about those people too. He told her so. "Then I will come with you," she said. He had expected this. He had also expected to object to it. He was, in fact, partway through the objection, something about danger and the importance of her staying safe, when she stopped him. "You were almost dead in a waterfall," she said. "I pulled you out. We are past the point where you protect me by keeping me ignorant of where you are." He looked at her. "Besides," she added, with a practicality that he found, despite himself, extremely attractive, "you still need the dressings changed every other day, and you do not know this forest as well as I do." Both of these things were true. "All right," he said. They left the following morning. The forest was different in daylight, and different again with two of them moving through it, and different still because he knew, now, where they were going, and knowing where you are going changes the landscape around you in ways that are hard to account for. The trees were the same trees. The path was the same path, but the quality of the air was different, charged with a purpose that the previous weeks had not held. She led him through the forest with the easy confidence of someone who has spent months learning its rhythms, and he followed, watching the back of her white hair and the set of her shoulders and the way she moved. Not gracefully exactly, not the performed grace of someone who has been trained to be observed, but with a kind of natural economy, a sense that her body knew what it was doing and trusted itself to do it. The first contact came 2 days east of the cabin, in a village that Odin knew belonged to one of his loyal generals, a man named Brath, old and plain-spoken and possessed of the particular reliability of someone who has never once done anything for any reason other than because it was right. Brath received him with an expression of such undisguised relief that the solemnity of the moment was slightly undercut, and then recovered himself and began to explain, rapidly and in great detail, what had been happening in the weeks since the king had disappeared. It was not good. The traitors, 7 men, led by a commander named Varel, who had served in the Eastern Campaign and apparently spent the subsequent years constructing a very patient plan, had announced that the king had been killed in a border skirmish and that the realm was now under transitional governance. They had not apparently anticipated that the king would survive. They had not made provision for this eventuality, which was, Brath noted with dry satisfaction, what always happened when men of insufficient imagination tried to play deep games. Odin listened to all of this with his commander's mind, the part of him that was purely strategic, filing information and building a picture, and beginning to see the shape of what needed to happen. But he was also aware, with a peripheral attention that he could not quite suppress, of Alicia. She sat slightly behind him in Brath's small hall, listening with the same focused attention she brought to everything. And when Brath finished, she asked 2 questions. Quiet, precise questions that immediately identified 2 vulnerabilities in Vorel's position that Odin had not quite articulated yet. Brath looked at her with evident respect. Odin looked at her with something more complicated. "Who is she?" Brath asked him, later, privately, with the bluntness of a man who has known someone long enough to dispense with preliminary orbiting. "Someone I trust," Odin said. Brath looked at him in the particular way that old friends have of communicating entire volumes without speaking. Then he nodded and went back to the maps. The following days were the days of gathering. Loyal generals and their forces, reassembled at the coordinates that Brath managed via a network of messengers that Vorel had apparently overlooked because he had underestimated the old man. Minor lords who had been waiting, with varying degrees of patience, for some clarity about what had actually happened to the king. Soldiers who had served under Odin in the Eastern Campaign and who, when word reached them that he was alive, responded with the particular ferocity of men who have been told a lie and want something done about it. Through all of this, Alicia was there. She did not lead armies. She did not pretend to military knowledge she did not have. But she had a quality that Odin had initially noticed and now watched with something approaching wonder. An ability to be genuinely, specifically helpful to whoever was in front of her, regardless of rank or context. She managed the medical needs of the gathering force with quiet competence. She listened to the things that people said around the edges of the official discussions, and sometimes brought those things to him, privately, in the evenings, because she had understood that the things said at the edges were often more important than the things said at the center. She had a gift, he was learning, for seeing what was actually happening as distinct from what was being presented. In the evenings, when the planning was done and the fires were low and the camp had settled into its nighttime sounds, they talked. The way they had talked in the cabin, directly and without performance, though now there was an additional layer. The awareness, growing between them the way things grow when they have been given warmth and time, that this was not simply conversation between two people who were temporarily proximate. It was something else. Something that neither of them had quite named. On the fourth evening, she asked him about fear. "You do not show it," she said. They were sitting outside the command tent with 2 cups of something warm, and the camp spread around them in the dark. "Even now, with all of this, I cannot tell if you do not feel it or if you have simply learned not to show it." He was quiet for a moment. "Both, sometimes," he admitted. "When I was younger, when I first became king, which happened earlier than anyone planned for and under circumstances that required me to be certain before I was ready to be, I learned to put it away. The fear. Because if the king shows fear, the fear spreads. That is the nature of a hierarchy. The emotional state of the person at the top moves downward through the whole structure." He paused. "After a while, putting it away becomes habit, and after a longer while, you begin to forget that you put it there. Where do you feel it then? When it finds its way through?" He thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. "In the small hours," he said. "In the quiet. The fears that are not about the large, obvious things, but about the things that cannot be solved with strategy." He looked at her. "The fear that I have spent so much time being what the realm needs, that I have not been what I actually am." She held his gaze. "Who are you, actually?" He considered for a long time. "I am finding out," he said at last. "More recently than I expected." She looked at him steadily, and then nodded, as if this was an answer she understood, and the recognition in her eyes told him that it was. That she was also finding out, that the past weeks had not only been recovery and travel and preparation, but also, underneath all of that, a process of her own that she was navigating in her own way. They sat together in the dark camp, and drank their warm drinks, and let the night be what it was, and between them, in the particular space that had developed over days of proximity and honesty, something grew. It had no name yet. It did not need one. But it was there, and they were both aware of it, and neither of them tried to make it into something it was not yet ready to be. The confrontation came on a gray morning, at the gates of the capital. Vorel had made a tactical error, several in fact, because a man who is convinced of his own cleverness often does. But the most significant one was underestimating the speed of the king's restoration. He had assembled the kind of power that looked impressive until it met something with actual conviction behind it, and then looked suddenly like what it was, a structure built on self-interest, held together by the particular glue of shared ambition, which dissolves quickly under pressure because everyone involved is waiting to see who will benefit most from cutting their losses. Odin rode at the front of his force, and he did not look like a man who had nearly died in a waterfall 3 weeks ago. He looked like what he was, a king who had been very briefly and inconveniently interrupted. He wore no armor of performance. He wore no expression calculated to inspire or intimidate. He simply came forward with the unhurried, implacable quality of something inevitable, and when Vorel's assembled force saw him, the first defections began before a single word was spoken. The exchange that followed was brief. Vorel attempted a speech. Odin waited for it to finish with complete patience. Then he spoke. 3 sentences, low and precise, each one a specific piece of evidence, delivered without anger or theater, that made it entirely clear to every man within earshot exactly what Vorel was and what he had done. The defections accelerated sharply. In the end, there was no great battle. There was a surrender, tense and humiliating for the man making it, and a restoration, swift and orderly for the realm receiving it. The 7 conspirators were taken into custody. The transitional governance dissolved like paper in rain, and the throne, which had been Odin's before and was still Odin's, was simply returned to the man it belonged to. Alicia stood at the edge of all of this and watched. She watched him in this context for the first time, in full authority, surrounded by the structure of power, all of it oriented toward him. And she understood, with a clarity that had something almost like physics to it, the duality of him. The man she had brought home from the waterfall, who had laughed about a spilled bucket and talked about fear in the small hours and listened to her with complete attention. That man was entirely real. And this man, here, at the center of a realm reasserting its proper order, ferocious and precise and utterly unhesitating, was also entirely real. They were not 2 different people. They were the same person, and the fact that they existed in the same body was not a contradiction, but a wholeness. He moved through the crowd after, greeting his generals, receiving information, issuing orders with the calm efficiency of someone who has done this for years. And then he crossed the courtyard and came to her, and the change was immediate and visible. A slight relaxation, a shift of something in the eyes, a softness that was not weakness but was completely deliberate, completely specific, as if the world at large received one version of him and she received another, and the choice was not unconscious. "It's over?" she asked. "The immediate part is over," he said. "The subsequent parts will take time. They always do." She nodded. Around them, the capital moved with the particular energy of a place that has just remembered what order feels like. "What happens now?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment. In the gray morning light, his eyes were very clear. "That," he said, "is something I would like to discuss with you." The weeks that followed were the weeks of restoration, the practical, unglamorous work of putting a realm back together after it has been briefly, violently mishandled. Odin did this with the focused efficiency she had come to associate with him, moving through the castle and the city and the surrounding territories with a tirelessness that impressed even the people who had always known him to be tireless. He was fair. He was direct. He did not punish collective guilt for the choices of a few, but he was absolutely clear about where the lines were and what happened to those who crossed them. Alicia lived in the castle during this time, in rooms that had been given to her quietly and without explanation, in the way that things are given when someone has understood something that does not yet have official language around it. She was not idle. She found the castle's healer and offered her assistance, and the healer, who was overwhelmed and practical, accepted it immediately. She walked the city and listened to what people were saying, because she had learned that what people were saying was often more accurate than what was being reported. She brought these things to Odin in the evenings, and he listened to them, and they were useful, and he told her so. Between them, the thing that had been growing continued to grow, now with more room. In the castle, with the crisis past and the immediate urgency quieted, there was space for smaller things, for the particular attention he brought to her when they were together, for the way he sought her out at the end of the day, not because there was business to discuss, but because there was not, for the fact that she was the only person in the castle who spoke to him without the careful calibration of someone who is aware of exactly what he is, and that he seemed to seek that out, to need it, the way people need things they have been without for too long. She brought him tea one evening in the room where he worked, because she had been in the habit, and had not stopped being in the habit just because the room was larger. He looked up when she came in, and something in his face when he looked at her was different from the face he wore for everything else, and it had been different for long enough now that she had stopped trying to explain it to herself, and had simply begun to accept that it was true. "Sit," he said. She sat. "I have been thinking," he began, and then stopped, which was unusual enough that she paid closer attention. Odin was a man who, When he began a sentence, generally knew where it was going. "About?" she prompted. He set down the document he had been holding. He looked at her directly, which he always did, but with a quality that was new. A slight vulnerability in it, controlled and brief, but unmistakable. A crack in something solid. "About what I am," he said. "About what you are. About what happens when the thing that has been true in a small cabin is also true in a large castle." He paused. "And about the fact that I am aware I am a king, and you are a woman who has been hurt before by men who did not deserve the trust you gave them, and that this context complicates what I want to say." She sat very still, in the way she sat when she was paying full attention. "And what is it that you want to say?" she asked. He met her gaze. "That I love you," he said. "That I have been aware of this for some time, and have been deciding whether to say it. That I have concluded that not saying it is a form of dishonesty I am not willing to practice with you." He continued, steady and unhurried. "That I understand if this requires time. That I understand if what you have been through means you need to go slowly. That I am not asking you for anything you are not ready to give. But I am telling you the truth, because you are the person I tell the truth to, and this is part of the truth." Alicia looked at him. She had thought about this. She had spent weeks thinking about it, carefully and honestly, the way she thought about things that mattered, turning them over, examining them from different angles, refusing to accept the first interpretation or the most comfortable one. She had thought about what she felt, and whether what she felt was simply gratitude or simply proximity, or simply the particular emotional vulnerability of a person who had been alone for a long time and was now, suddenly, not alone. She had concluded, after all of that thought, that it was none of those things, or rather, it was all of those things, and it was also something else. Something that had been true since she had sat with him by the fire and listened to him talk about the fear that comes in the small hours, and recognized in him a particular loneliness that was the mirror of her own, and felt something in her chest that was not pity and was not tenderness exactly, and was not easily named, but was absolutely real. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "I know because I feel it too," she said, "and I have been taking my time with it because I needed to be certain it was real, and not something else. And I am certain." She paused. "I am also certain that I am frightened, not of you, of the pattern, of the habit of trusting and being wrong." "Yes," he said simply, understanding this without requiring her to explain it. "But I have thought about it," she continued, "and I think the alternative of not allowing it to be real because I am afraid it might not last, is not actually safer. It is just smaller." She looked at him. "And I do not want to be smaller than what I actually am." He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood, came around the desk, and sat in the chair beside her rather than across from her. And when he took her hand in his, carefully, with an attentiveness that communicated exactly how much this mattered, she felt the warmth of it move through her like the first cup of tea on a cold morning. "I am not Cartius," he said. "No," she agreed. "You are not." "I am a man who has been alone for a very long time and has, until recently, believed this was simply the cost of what he was, and who has now revised this conclusion." He looked at their joined hands. "And who intends, if you will allow it, to demonstrate over a very significant period of time that he is not the kind of man who leaves." Alicia looked at their hands too. His was large and scarred and warm, with the particular warmth that comes from strength rather than effort, and hers was small and pale within it, and there was something in the image that she found unexpectedly beautiful. "That," she said, "sounds like a very good plan." He asked her to marry him on a morning when the castle garden was in full bloom, 3 months after the night at the waterfall. On a day when the light was exactly the honest light she had described in the dark of the cabin while he was barely conscious and somehow heard every word. He did not make a speech. He was not a man who made speeches about personal things, having learned to reserve that particular energy for public occasions where it was required. He simply told her what it was, that he was asking her to be his queen. Not because a king needed a queen in the abstract sense, but because this specific man needed this specific woman with a certainty he had not felt about anything this personal in his entire life. She said yes before he finished. Not impulsively, not without thought. She said yes because she had been thinking about it for 3 months, in the way she thought about things that mattered. And she was certain. The wedding was everything the other one had not been, and not because of its scale or its ceremony or the number of people who came from every part of the realm to witness it. It was everything because it was real, because the man who stood beside her at the altar was the man she had carried through a dark forest, and who had listened to her talk about a garden, and who had told her the truth even when it was complicated. Because when she looked at him, the thing she felt in her chest was not the fragile, anxious thing she had felt before, the thing that was always waiting to be taken away, but something solid and warm and hers. She wore her white hair unbound because he had told her once, simply and without elaboration, that he found it beautiful, and she had believed him because he was not a man who said things he did not mean. She wore a gown the color of winter morning, pale silver that caught the light the way fresh snow does, and when she walked toward him through the great hall of the castle where he had ruled for years, and where she would now rule alongside him, she felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely herself. Not smaller than she was, not diminished, not careful, not waiting for the thing that was good to be taken away. Just herself, walking toward the man who loved her, in the life that had grown from the ruin of another one. Odin's expression when he saw her, that precise, controlled man who had learned to keep his inner life private out of long necessity, was not private at all. There was nothing hidden in the way he looked at her. His eyes, winter sky gray and full of everything he had, for once, decided not to contain, said what he would not say publicly, because it was hers, and not the realm's, that he had spent years knowing what it cost to be king, and had not known, until a woman pulled him out of a waterfall in the dark, what it could mean to be loved. They were married in the full light of a late spring morning, with the garden visible through the high windows, and the realm bearing witness, and the thing between them, the tether that had sent her dreaming through the dark to find him, singing, quietly, in the space between their joined hands. The months that followed were good months, not uncomplicated. A realm that has been disrupted requires sustained attention, and sustained attention is rarely compatible with simplicity. There were difficult decisions and long hours, and occasionally contentious councils where men who had served for decades had to recalibrate their understanding of what the queen's role was, because it turned out to be rather different than they had expected. Alicia did not perform deference she did not feel, and she did not pretend to certainties she did not have. But she brought to every situation the same quality she had always brought: direct attention, specific questions, and the willingness to say what was actually true rather than what was politic. It took some adjustment. It also earned, over time, a respect that was not the polite, reflexive kind, but the real kind, the kind that comes from watching someone be consistently, demonstrably right. Odin watched this happen with a satisfaction so deep and personal that he kept it mostly to himself, because it was the kind of satisfaction that has nothing to do with triumph, and everything to do with the particular joy of seeing someone become fully what they were always capable of being. He gave her room to be that. He did not hover. He did not intercede unnecessarily. He allowed her to make her own authority, in her own way, because he understood, with the understanding of someone who had been given authority externally and had always had to make it real from the inside, that this was the only way it meant anything. But he was also, always and completely, there. There when the council was difficult, and she came back to their rooms afterward, with that slight line between her brows that meant she was working through something. There with tea. He had learned to make it, because he had wanted to learn something of hers. And the willingness to listen. And then, when she had finished working through it, the pointed observation that sometimes resolved the whole thing in 30 seconds. There in the mornings, in the particular way of people who have decided to build a life together, rather than simply occupy the same space. In the evenings, in the small rituals that accumulate between people over months and become the private language of a shared life. The way she brought her feet up under her when she sat, still, and he still found it quietly charming. The way he stood at windows when he was thinking, and she had learned to give him the thinking time, and then ask the question that opened it. The way they moved around each other in shared spaces with the easy, unself-conscious familiarity of people who have stopped performing and simply are. He was different with her than he was with the world. The world received the version of him that it had always received. Direct, precise, ferocious when ferocity was called for, absolutely implacable in the face of anything that threatened the people or the principles he was responsible for. The men who tested him in council did not test him twice. The neighboring lords who occasionally mistook his measured tone for weakness discovered their mistake with a speed and thoroughness that became, in certain circles, something close to legend. But she received something different. She received the man who laughed at the bucket, who told her about fear in the small hours, who made tea and brought it to her without announcement, and who had learned her preferences, a little less steep, no honey, unless it was the herbal kind from the kitchen garden. Because he paid attention, because she mattered to him specifically and personally and not as an abstraction, who touched her with a carefulness that had nothing to do with fragility and everything to do with the particular reverence of a person who has understood that what they have been given is rare, who told her, regularly and without prompting, that he loved her. Not as ritual, not as habit, but as information, as the true thing that it was, offered consistently, because he had decided that the truth, with her, was always what he would choose. She had not known, when she walked out of the cabin that night to find a man dying in a waterfall, that she was also walking toward herself, toward the version of herself that the previous months of grief and isolation had been, in some impossible way, preparing her for. She had thought she was going toward an obligation, the responsibility of a voice in a dream, the call of something she did not understand. She had not known she was going toward love, but that was the nature of the tether. It did not announce itself. It simply called you toward what was true. They had been married 7 months when visitors came to the castle. The steward brought the message in the mid-morning, when Alicia was in the castle's small library. She had claimed it, quietly, and without formal declaration, and no one had objected, and Odin was in the south wing with his military advisor. The steward looked, as he sometimes did when delivering news whose reception was uncertain, as if he wished he were somewhere else. "My lady," he said, "there are 2 people at the gate who have asked for an audience. I am told they gave their names as Cartius and Remilia." Alicia set her book down with great care. She was quiet for a moment. The library had high windows that let in the afternoon light, the honest light, the kind she had calibrated her mood by in the cabin, and it fell across the desk in long, pale rectangles, and the dust moved slowly in it, and everything was very still. "Where are they?" she asked. "At the gate, my lady. They have not been admitted. I wanted to speak with you first." She nodded. "Tell them to wait. I will speak with the king." She found Odin in the south wing, and she told him. Briefly and without ornamentation, because that was how she told him things, and he received it the same way, completely still, absorbing it, then present. "You knew who they were to me," she said. "I told you." "Yes." He looked at her. "What do you want to do?" She thought about this. She had thought about the possibility of this moment. Not often, and not with any expectation that it would happen. But she had thought about it, in the oblique, preparatory way that the mind sometimes thinks about things it is not quite ready to address directly. "I want to see them," she said, "but I want to know first. What are they? What do they look like?" He had already sent for information, because he was Odin, and that was what he did. The report had come back quickly. 2 people at the gate, presenting themselves in the condition that the steward, with careful neutrality, had described as travel-worn, in the condition that the gate guard, with less neutrality, had described as diminished. Alicia heard the description. She held it, and felt the various things it contained, and sorted through them with the same methodical care she brought to everything. They were brought to the great hall. She had not seen them in 7 months. In 7 months she had changed, not only in circumstance but in herself, in the way that a person changes when they have been broken and rebuilt with better materials. She stood in the great hall beside her husband, who was the king, and she was the queen, and she looked at the 2 people who had dismantled her life and left without looking back. They were barely recognizable. Carseus had the particular quality of a man who has discovered that the thing he thought he wanted was not what he thought it was, and has been paying for that discovery ever since. He was thinner, with a thinness that was not the lean kind, but the depleted kind. His eyes, when they found hers, had the complex quality of someone carrying guilt that has become, after sufficient time and insufficient processing, its own illness. Remilia looked worse. Alicia had spent 4 months hating her sister, or trying to. It had been more complicated than pure hatred, because underneath the betrayal was the long, layered history of 2 sisters, and history is not clean. She had spent those 4 months in the cabin learning to separate the grief of the betrayal from the grief of the loss, because they were not the same grief, even though they had arrived together. She looked at Remilia now and felt not what she had expected to feel. She felt the old grief, the specific grief of someone who had loved her sister and been discarded. She felt, underneath that, something quieter and more exhausted, something that was not quite pity, but was adjacent to it. The recognition of a person who has chosen badly and is now living in the consequences of that choice. She did not feel rage. She had thought she might. She had half expected it to come back, the acute kind, the kind that had been present in those first weeks in the cabin, when she had sometimes stood at the window and felt it rise in her like something that needed to be released and had nowhere to go. It was not there. Carseus stepped forward. He had the look of a man who has rehearsed something many times and is not confident in the performance. "Alicia," he began. "You may address me as the Queen," she said, calmly and without particular coldness, simply as information. He stopped. Something moved through his expression, and she recognized it. It was shame, and it was real, which was both satisfying and entirely beside the point. Remilia stepped forward then, and her voice, when it came, was the voice of someone who has been humbled by something larger than herself. "We need help," she said. "We have nowhere else to go. We are ill, both of us, and we have nothing left." The great hall was very quiet. The assembled people of the court, those who had drifted in as the news moved through the castle, were watching, waiting. Alicia felt Odin beside her, not touching but present, the way he was always present, fully and specifically there, with all his attention, leaving the decision entirely to her while making it entirely clear that whatever she decided, he would support it. She looked at her sister, and at the man who had been her mate, and she thought about who she was and what she was made of, and about the choice she had made 4 months ago when she walked out into the dark because a voice told her to save a man she had never met. She thought about what it had cost her, and what it had given her. "I did not become the queen of this realm so that I could exercise my power in cruelty," she said, and her voice carried in the hall with a steadiness that surprised no one who had been paying attention. "And I did not survive what I survived in order to become someone who lets others suffer, because it would be satisfying to watch. She paused. You will be given rooms. You will be seen by the healers. You will be cared for. Another pause, and this one had something different in it. Not severity, but a precision. And you will not mistake this for an absence of memory. I remember what was done. I have simply decided that it is not what I am going to carry into the rest of my life. The silence in the hall was absolute. Romelia closed her eyes, and the tears that came were not the performed kind. Carcius looked at her with an expression she could not quite categorize, and she realized after a moment that it was wonder. The particular wonder of a person who has done damage, and been shown, unexpectedly, that the person they damaged has become something they never imagined. Something beyond what he had been capable of seeing in her. She found that she did not particularly care about his wonder. It was not for him. None of this was for him. It was for her. Odin beside her did not say anything, because there was nothing to say. But his hand found hers, briefly, with a warmth and specificity that said what words were not needed to say. That evening, in the rooms they shared, he told her she was remarkable. She thought about arguing, the way she sometimes argued when he said things that felt too large for her to hold. Then she thought about the fact that she had promised herself, in the cabin, in the months of silence, that she would not be smaller than what she actually was. I know, she said instead. I am beginning to know that. He looked at her, and the expression on his face was the one she loved most. The one that had nothing to do with being a king, that was purely and specifically his, given only to her. The look of a man who was, against all expectation, exactly where he wanted to be. Good, he said. The spring came again. A full year from the night she had walked through the dark forest to find a man dying at the base of the waterfall, and the spring came back to the forest, and to the castle gardens, and to the realm, and everything that had been dormant began again, with the relentless impersonal optimism of living things. Alicia walked in the castle garden on a morning when the light was exactly right. The honest light, golden and clear, the kind that shows everything as it actually is. And she thought about the year behind her, with the particular clarity that only comes when enough time has passed to see the shape of things. She thought about the woman who had lived in the small cabin, carrying her grief like a stone at the bottom of a well. That woman had not been wrong about her grief. It had been real, and it had been earned, and it had deserved to be felt. But that woman had also believed underneath everything that the grief was the final chapter. That what had been taken was what she was, and without it, there was nothing remaining worth having. She had been wrong about that. She had been profoundly, instructively wrong, and she was grateful for it in the way that you can only be grateful for the things that required you to change. The tether was real. She knew this now, not as a mystical abstraction, but as a lived, physical fact. The thing that had sent her into the dark, that had called her to a dying man at the base of a waterfall, was the same thing that made his hand in hers feel like something that had always been true and had simply been waiting for the circumstances to demonstrate it. She did not fully understand the mechanics of it. She was not sure the mechanics were the point. The point was that she had gone. She had been afraid and alone, and she had nothing left to lose, and she had gone anyway. And that choice, that single, unremarkable, entirely necessary choice to believe that a dream was information, had brought her to everything she now had. She heard him before she saw him, the sound of his boots on the garden path. And then he was beside her, having come from the morning's first meeting, which he always tried to finish early on the days she did not need to attend, because he liked the mornings better than the rest of the day, and liked them best when she was in them. He stood beside her in the garden and looked at the spring light, and she looked at him looking at it, and the simplicity of the moment was the kind of simplicity that contains everything. "The robin is back," she said. He looked to where she was pointing, the old split in the garden wall where a robin had built a nest, remarkably similar in location, and apparent engineering philosophy to the robin from the cabin's birch tree. Is she cross? Extremely. I think there is a territorial dispute. Serious business, he said. And the almost smile became an actual smile, and it was still slightly crooked and still completely warm, and she still found it impossible not to answer. He took her hand. They stood in the garden in the spring light and watched the indignant robin, and the light was honest, and everything was exactly as it was. Which was, it turned out, enough. More than enough. In the kingdom they governed together, ferocious and gentle by turns, precise and warm, carrying the weight of many lives with the particular seriousness of people who understand what weight means. There was a story told, in various forms and with various embellishments, about the night a dying king was carried home by an Omega woman who had been abandoned and had chosen, in her abandonment, to remain someone who could still save things. The story was told because it was true, and because it was the kind of truth that people need to hear. That ruin is not always an ending. That the voice in the dream is sometimes worth following. That the person who has lost everything and walked into the dark anyway is the person capable of finding what the dark is hiding. That love, when it comes from loss and honesty, and the willingness to walk through the dark because something true is calling you forward, is the kind of love that becomes the foundation of things. Not the fragile, anxious love that waits to be betrayed, but the solid kind, the kind that is not afraid of what it is, the kind that endures. Because sometimes, when everything has been taken and there is nothing left but the choice of what to do with the emptiness is not the end of the story. It is the space where the true story finally has room to begin. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. Let us know what you thought of this tale full of emotions and surprises. Tell us your name, where you're watching from, and rate this story from 0 to 10 if it touched your heart. And if you enjoyed the plot, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the amazing new stories coming soon. See you next time.